It was a cold Tuesday morning in late October 2019, when the quiet corridors of St. Mary's Hospital in Chicago carried the sound of a wheelchair being pushed into an isolated recovery ward. Inside sat Eleanor Wright, 78 years old, frail, after surgery, her eyes searching the hallway for a familiar face. But no one came. Her children, who had promised to return, had already left the hospital, leaving only a bag of clothes and a folder of medical instructions on the side table. The nurse on duty recorded the details in the hospital log. Patient discharged from immediate care. No family present for pickup. It was an entry that felt clinical, almost routine. But for Eleanor, it was the crushing confirmation that she had been abandoned, not just by circumstance, but by blood. What no one knew, however, was that in the pocket of that small, leather handbag resting by her bed lay an old, yellowed envelope. A forgotten letter, sealed decades ago, carrying the weight of secrets that could shatter the fragile facade of her family and bring back a love thought to be lost forever. Eleanor Wright had never imagined her life would end in loneliness. Born in 1941 in a modest neighborhood of Milwaukee, she grew up during a time when family ties meant survival. Her father worked long shifts in a steel factory, while her mother carried the warmth of the home on her shoulders. Eleanor inherited that same resilience. Neighbors often recalled how she was the girl who smiled through hardships, the one who never complained, even when money was scarce. In her 20s, she was admired for her quiet elegance, her soft brown eyes, her calm presence, and the discipline with which she carried herself. She studied to become a school teacher, believing education could lift children out of the same struggles she had known. It was in those early years that she first tasted love, a love so strong that it promised to defy time itself. But life, as it often does, intervened. Choices were made, paths diverged, and that chapter of her youth was closed before it ever had a chance to fully bloom. She later married a man who was steady but distant, and together they raised 3 children. She gave them everything she could: sleepless nights, sacrifices, years of careful saving so they could attend good schools. The irony, cruel as it was, is that those very children who had once been cradled in her arms would become the ones to forget her in her most fragile moment. The hospital stay was not her first brush with abandonment. It was simply the loudest. Friends had passed away. Neighbors had moved on. Her husband had died years earlier. What remained was a small apartment filled with photos, letters, and memories, silent witnesses to a life of giving without much return. And yet, there was something more. Hidden among her belongings was that old letter, written decades earlier, never mailed. A letter filled with words she had once been too afraid to send, words written for a man whose presence in her life had been brief but unforgettable. Words that, unbeknownst to her children, still carried a truth powerful enough to expose betrayal and awaken a forgotten destiny. The days after her surgery stretched into a blur of fluorescent lights, antiseptic smells, and the quiet hum of medical equipment. Eleanor remained in her bed, waiting for someone to walk through the door. A phone call, a message, even a familiar hand reaching out to reassure her. It never came. The nurses, compassionate yet burdened with endless duties, offered polite words and professional smiles, but they were not family. Hospital records noted that her children had been contacted twice. Once by the attending physician, reminding them that Eleanor was medically cleared for discharge, and once by social services, explaining that she could not be released without someone to receive her. Both times, there was no response. The silence on the other end of the line carried an indictment sharper than any spoken word. How could a woman who had sacrificed her youth for her children now be left as though she were a burden? How could promises of love and loyalty be erased so quickly by convenience? These were questions that echoed not only in Eleanor's fragile heart, but in the conscience of everyone who witnessed her case. The injustice deepened when whispers began circulating among staff. One nurse recounted overhearing a brief conversation between Eleanor's eldest son and the billing department. Weeks before the surgery, he had asked, almost coldly, whether his mother's insurance would cover everything necessary and whether there would be any financial responsibilities left to the family. There was no mention of visiting her, of insuring her, comfort of simply being present. Only numbers, figures, and liabilities. For Eleanor, each empty day became a reminder that love could not be measured by the decades she had devoted to motherhood. Each passing hour widened the void between her sacrifices and their silence. Her wedding ring, still resting on her frail finger, seemed to mock the promises of loyalty and family unity that had long since dissolved into neglect. It was in this atmosphere of quiet despair that a young nurse named Catherine stumbled upon the leather handbag beside Eleanor's bed. She was reorganizing the patient's belongings to prepare for yet another day of uncertainty when her hand brushed against the worn fabric. Inside, hidden beneath folded scarves and a wallet, she discovered a yellowed envelope, sealed but fragile with age. The handwriting was elegant, deliberate, unmistakably from another era. The name on the front read, "To Thomas, with all my heart, Eleanor." Why had this letter never been sent? Who was Thomas? And why did his name still rest so carefully preserved after all these years? Catherine hesitated, sensing she had uncovered something personal, perhaps even sacred. She tucked the envelope back, but the discovery lingered in her mind. Later that night, while completing her shift notes, she found herself unable to shake the image of the forgotten letter. It seemed almost symbolic, as though the universe itself had preserved these words for a reason, waiting for the right moment to come alive. Meanwhile, Eleanor's children remained absent. Their silence grew louder, their indifference heavier. Questions began to surface. Was this abandonment born of resentment, of selfishness? Or was there something deeper, a secret buried in the past that explained their distance? Every observer, nurses, doctors, even patients in nearby rooms felt the weight of the injustice. Eleanor had been reduced to a number on a chart, a bed to be vacated, a case to be managed. And yet, within her belongings, there lay evidence of a story untold, one that could unravel the fragile lies her family had built. The conflict had reached a boiling point. A woman who had given everything was left with nothing, except a letter that could change everything. The tension reached its peak one rainy evening in November 2019. The hospital's discharge board had already assigned Eleanor's bed to another patient. Protocol demanded she leave within 48 hours. But where could she go? Her children had not answered a single call, and social services were running out of options. The situation grew so dire that a formal note was added to her file. No family response. Patient at risk of involuntary transfer to state facility. It was the kind of entry no elderly parent ever imagined seeing attached to their name. A bureaucratic stamp that reduced a lifetime of love and sacrifice to a logistical inconvenience. Eleanor sat silently by the window, her eyes fixed on the storm outside. The world moved on while she remained forgotten. The indignity of being treated like a burden burned deeper than the physical pain of her stitches. How could her own children erase her existence so completely? And the forgotten envelope resurfaced. Nurse Catherine, troubled by the thought of leaving Eleanor to the mercy of strangers, decided to bring the letter to her attention. With trembling hands, Eleanor held the yellowed paper against her chest. The seal was still intact, fragile, with age. She whispered the name, Thomas, as though speaking it aloud for the first time in decades awakened a dormant part of her soul. Tears filled her eyes. She remembered the night she had written it, back in 1962, after a farewell she thought would last forever. She had poured her heart onto those pages, confessing love, fear, and a promise she had never dared to keep. Why had she hidden? All these years, perhaps out of shame, perhaps because life had demanded sacrifices she could not refuse. Now, in the sterile air of a hospital room, that letter seemed to carry more weight than any medical record. Catherine urged her gently. "Mrs. Wright, maybe this letter still matters. Maybe it explains more than you think." But Eleanor hesitated. What if opening it would reveal truths too heavy to bear? What if it exposed wounds her children had used as excuses for their cruelty? The rain outside intensified, hammering against the glass, as though nature itself demanded the truth be revealed. The hospital, once a place of healing, had become a stage of unbearable injustice. An elderly woman abandoned, her dignity questioned, her future uncertain. And in her hands lay the one document capable of changing everything. The following morning, the hospital room felt unusually still. Catherine returned with determination in her eyes. She placed the fragile envelope on Eleanor's bedside table and whispered, "It's time." With shaky fingers, Eleanor broke the seal. The letter inside, written on cream-colored stationery, had survived more than half a century. The ink was slightly faded, but the words carried the full force of a young woman's heart. "Thomas, I was too afraid to speak the truth before. You left. The child I am carrying is yours. I don't know how to face my family, nor how to explain to the world. They expect me to marry Robert. But I cannot forget you. If fate ever brings you back, know that I loved you then. And I will love you always, Eleanor." The silence that followed was deafening. Catherine's eyes widened. The implications were staggering. Eleanor's eldest son, the very one who had dismissed her as a burden, was not Robert's child at all. He was Thomas's, a truth buried by decades of silence, a truth that explained the cold distance that had grown between Eleanor and her children. Eleanor wept, not out of shame, but out of release. For years she had carried the secret alone, punished by her own silence. Now the words were out in the open, undeniable. Catherine, sensing the gravity of what she held, alerted the hospital's social worker, who in turn documented the letter as part of Eleanor's file. A new kind of record now stood beside the medical charts, a personal testimony, evidence of a family history rewritten. But fate was not finished with her. 2 days later, as Eleanor prepared for forced transfer to a state facility, a visitor arrived at the hospital reception. He was tall, his hair silver with age, but his eyes still burned with the same warmth they had carried in the 1960s. His name, recorded in the visitor's log, read, Thomas Caldwell. The reunion was almost unreal. Thomas had never married. He had searched for Eleanor after leaving for military service, but the letter had never reached him. He had carried her memory like an unfinished chapter, a wound that refused to close. A friend from his old neighborhood, now a volunteer at the hospital, had heard about Eleanor's situation and recognized her name. That was how fate, after all these decades, brought him back. When Thomas entered the room, Eleanor froze. For a moment, the years melted away. The frail woman in a hospital gown was the same girl he had once held beneath summer skies. Tears blurred her vision as she whispered his name. Thomas. He knelt by her side, taking her hand gently. I never stopped looking for you, he said, his voice trembling. And now, I will not let you face this alone. The justice Eleanor had been denied by her children was now delivered by destiny itself. Thomas immediately stepped forward, declaring his willingness to take responsibility for Eleanor's care. The hospital staff, moved by the turn of events, documented his guardianship request. For the first time in weeks, Eleanor's future no longer hung in bureaucratic uncertainty. News of the revelation reached her children, who could no longer hide behind indifference. The letter, now copied and preserved, exposed their neglect not only as cruelty, but as hypocrisy. Their mother, once dismissed as weak and irrelevant, was vindicated by the truth and defended by the very man who had once been cast aside. Eleanor, though frail, felt dignity return. She was no longer abandoned. She was no longer invisible. She had found justice in the revelation of truth and love in the arms of the one destiny had always reserved for her. In the end, Eleanor's story was no longer one of abandonment, but of redemption. What had begun as a cruel act of neglect transformed into a testimony of resilience, truth, and the mysterious ways destiny intervenes when all seems lost. The letter, once buried in silence, became her voice. It exposed injustice, unmasked ingratitude, and restored her dignity in front of those who had tried to erase her. But beyond justice, it reopened a door that many believe closes forever with time. The door to love. As Eleanor leaned on Thomas's arm, walking slowly out of the hospital that had witnessed both her lowest humiliation and her most powerful vindication, every step felt like a victory over despair. She was not leaving as a forgotten patient, but as a woman reclaimed by truth and embraced by destiny. Perhaps that is the greatest lesson her story leaves behind, that even in the twilight of life, justice can prevail, and love can return. Unexpected, undeniable, eternal. Because sometimes the heart remembers what the world forgets.